Are you also tired of one-size-fits-all weight loss plans? Meet Noom, the personalized solution that meets you where you are. Noom is able to understand your unique needs, from dietary restrictions to medical concerns. Unlike restrictive programs, Noom embraces your lifestyle and choices. Discover a sustainable approach to weight loss, tailored just for you. Honestly, Noom felt like it was made for me. It's not just about what I eat, it's about understanding why. With Noom, I've learned so much about myself and built healthier habits that stick. It's all about progress, not perfection. Say goodbye to restrictive diets and experience the Noom app for yourself with personalized lessons and expert coaching. Noom's psychology and biology-based approach has helped over 5.2 million people achieve their goals. Stay focused on what's important to you with Noom's psychology and biology-based approach. Sign up for your trial today at Noom.com. That's Noom.com. And check out Noom's first ever cookbook, The Noom Kitchen, for 100 healthy and delicious recipes to promote better living. Available to buy now wherever books are sold.
At the UPS Store, we know things can get busy this upcoming holiday. You can count on us to be open and ready to help with any packing and shipping or anything else you might need.
Is there anything you can't do?
Actually, I don't have a good singing voice. The UPS... Nope. But our certified packing experts can pack and ship just about anything.
At least that's good.
The UPS Store. Be unstoppable. Most locations are independently owned. Product, services, pricing, and hours of operation may vary. See Center for details. Come in today to get your holiday goodies there on time.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and I have an interview episode for you. I am so excited about this interview, which has to do with a recent find that I think is going to fascinate all of you. This is a timely conversation that I had here with a fellow fan of fictional crime. Let's just get right to the interview, where all will be explained. My guest today is Karen Robinson, who is a journalist based in London. Karen founded and ran the Crime Club newsletter for the Times and Sunday Times newspapers, covering the best of contemporary crime fiction. And she now serves as a judge for the annual John Creasy Dagger, the prestigious award given each year by the British Crime Writers Association for the best first crime novel. She and the panel have actually just chosen this year's winner, but she can't tell us what it is just yet. I love a good mystery, of course, and I'm looking forward to finding out who that winner is. But we have something else to discuss today, which was the subject of an article Karen wrote for the Sunday Times recently. It has to do with a discovery made in the archive of the British Psychoanalytical Society, and it concerns Agatha Christie, specifically Christie's activities during the First World War, when, as many of you know, she worked as a nurse and later as a dispenser in her native town of Torquay as part of the VAD, the Voluntary Aid Detachment. Much is made of the fact that this is where Agatha Christie became acquainted with poisons, which she would go on to use so often in her mysteries. Christie actually describes this period of her life in some detail in her autobiography, and Catherine and I have talked about that a lot on this podcast in the past. But since she tells us so little about her writing life in any of her autobiographical accounts, we don't have much in the way of how this period in Christie's life may have contributed to her future career as a writer. We also don't have very many of her earliest writings. And in both regards, the discovery made in this archive is an absolute gem because it gives us a glimpse into Agatha Christie's writing endeavors while in the VAD, in and around the time she was writing her first mystery novel, The Mysterious Affair at Styles. So I just wanted to contextualize this slightly for all of us Christie-addled people. And at this point, I would love to welcome Karen onto the podcast. And Karen, I'm going to ask you to take it from here and tell us all about this discovery.
Well, thank you very much, Kemper. It's lovely to be here. So I was contacted by one of my contacts at the British Psychoanalytical Society, who said, we've got an Agatha Christie early typescript. And, you know, you can imagine, can't you? Be still my beating heart. So So I went off to see it in their archive, and rather disappointingly for an archive, they didn't make me wear white gloves, but it's very archival. There's a wonderful archivist there who's done a lot of work on this as well. And what he presented me with was a handmade magazine typed with all kinds of skits, poems, songs, pastiche newspaper articles, a problem page called Aunt Agatha's Corner. Very jokey, educated, very much about the world of that VAD hospital and the young women who worked there. But it wasn't signed Agatha Christie. It was, in fact, some of the items, some of the pieces were signed AC, and quite a few of them had Agatha's name in them, Agatha's problem page, Agatha's, all this kind of thing, Aunt Agatha's Corner. But there were other initials. So, we were thinking, well, there's got to be some kind of issue with attribution here. So how did this supposed Agatha Christie, but we weren't quite sure yet, document end up with the esteemed Association of British Psychoanalysts? It was in the archive of a woman who went on to be an extremely distinguished psychoanalyst herself, Sylvia Payne. And Sylvia Payne, Agatha Christie, aged 24 in 1914. Sorry, I'm digressing here. Agatha Christie,
please.
in 1914, aged 24, a fiancée. At that point, she was Agatha Miller, but married her husband, Archie Christie, in December 1914. She was 24. She was, gently bred young woman, volunteered, as so many did, for the Voluntary Aid Detachment to carry out nursing duties, really quite lowly duties, at this hospital that had been set up in the town hall in Torquay, which was then a very elegant, fashionable place to live, seaside resort in Devon, and now, of course, the home of the annual Agatha Christie Festival. Mm-hmm. And Sylvia Payne was a very interesting woman, 10 years older than Agatha at that point. She was 34, and she was married to a GP. She had small children, and she was living in Torquay, where his practice was. She was a qualified doctor, one of relatively very, very few at that time, women qualified as doctors. And she was drafted in to run the hospital. She was the boss of the hospital. She was Agatha's boss. Obviously, a very female environment. All the men were off fighting. The patients, obviously, were all men, wounded horribly in body and mind. But the whole organization was women keeping it going, really. So Sylvia was Agatha's boss. Now, Sylvia's not mentioned in this magazine. They're not having a go at the boss in a satirical way. It's more the girls sort of talking, the young women talking to each other. So the psychoanalysts get this package of material from Sylvia Payne's son, Kenneth, who donated her papers to the archive. And amongst these papers, mostly about psychoanalysis, obviously, among the papers was a mysterious plain foolscap manila envelope, Ewan tells us, addressed in ink pen to Sylvia Payne, the address part obscured by a sticker and overwritten in biro with the words property of son, Kenneth Payne, and script by Agatha Christie, third dispenser in Torquay Hospital, Devon, 1914 to 18, was what was scrawled across it. And inside was this handmade magazine titled What We Did in the Great War. So that's where they found it. It's got nothing to do with psychoanalysis, but it was very much for Sylvia Payne. Now, we're really not sure how Sylvia Payne got this. Whether Agatha sent it to her afterwards, we just don't know. You can speculate, but we don't want to speculate. But they obviously knew each other, and at a certain point, Agatha Christie sent this to Sylvia Payne. Now, as I said, I was thinking when I was told about this document. Oh my God, a never before seen Agatha Christie manuscript. This would be. However, be still my beating heart. It turned out, and then of course it was, well, look, it's not signed. It's just AC. How do we know it's her? Although the clues are obviously there. And then I contacted the Agatha Christie archive, and the archivist there, which is run by Agatha Christie's grandson, Matthew Pritchard, and contains all kinds of wonderful things. And the archivist there, who's called Joe, we were speaking on the phone, and I told him what I got, and he said, "Oh yeah," he said, "that sounds like the one we've got." Which you can imagine my head kind of banging on the table. So I thought, well, okay, so attribution is now no longer a problem. And in fact, this one in their archive, people had seen it and written about it a bit. So it's not 100% new discovery, but at least we know it was something to do with Agatha, and she had a big hand in it. But I think, you can tell that from so much of the style and the content. Can I just talk a bit about, the VADs and Agatha's world at that point?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Keep it brief. So Agatha, at the start of the First World War, her family, as people know, had money problems, but they were, it was a genteel household. And this is a detail that I'm absolutely fascinated with. She was a young unmarried woman. She lived at home, and her life consisted of, dress fittings, croquet, tea parties, well-behaved, well-mannered, genteel stuff. And young women in those days, before the war, when they went out or in society, they wore corsets. And what I will find this out by the time we do our event next year, because I really want to know, did the VADs wear corsets? Because all these well-grown women, they must have had to dispense with the corsets while they were mopping the wards. And the corsets are they stand for a kind of, a real change in, and it wasn't just Agatha Christie, everybody's life in England and Britain was upturned by the First World War. The men went off, the women had to hold the fort and do things. There was tragedy, there was violence, there was death. It was a huge, huge change. And that was part of Agatha's upbringing, her growing up. The VADs, there were a few other well-known writers actually who were VADs. Vera Brittain, who wrote Testament of Youth, she was a VAD. There's E.M. Delafield, who wrote Diary of a Country Lady. She was one. The middle class young women flocked in to volunteer to do this role. There isn't any hint of any kind of snobbery in the what we did in the Great War. It's funny and it's teasing of each other, but it's been recorded about the VADs that, well, the regular nurses disapproved of them because they came in without training and, they didn't have the discipline and the training that the regular nurses did. So as, in any kind of situation, I suppose, where the volunteers arrive, the professionals are thinking, oh, really? Mm-hmm. And also it's also been reported that some of these genteel young ladies were rather snobby about the regular nurses. So there was, these people were mixing in a way and meeting each other in a way that hadn't happened before the war. So Agatha Christie, as she was after December 1914, became, it really opened up her world, really, which for a writer has got to be a good thing, hasn't it? All classes, all types of people. I'd say that it was mostly women, which indeed obviously it was, but there were a few chaps in the dispensary, because the other important thing about what Agatha did in the war is that she moved from the ward to the dispensary, where medicines were mixed up and, taken out to give to the patients. And she learned a lot. In the Christie archive run by Matthew Pritchard, they have a copy of her book of, medicines or drugs but the pharmacopoeia. Mm-hmm. And it's so detailed tiny print, all these, Latin names, what it is, what it does, how it's, she studied that and really learned, the arts of, of medicines, compounds that can heal, but also can kill. And there's a famous example in an interview she gave much later on about her time in the war, where she didn't have a lot of respect for the old boys who were in charge of the dispensary, who did not have a lot of respect for a young woman like her. And at one point, one of the chaps made a whole kind of tray of doses of medicine to give around the ward. Painkiller, I'm not sure what it was meant to be. But Agatha Christie saw him doing this and thought, he's got that wrong. This is not going to do them good. It's going to do them harm. But she, in those days, couldn't say, I think you've made a mistake. So all she could do was knock it to the ground, to the floor. And then, of course, it was, oh, you stupid, clumsy girl. But at least, she stopped a whole ward full of men getting the wrong medicine. You've probably heard that story before.
Well, she recounts it at great length in her autobiography, actually. And even in the autobiography, she only will refer to him as Mr. P. And she tells that story, and the way she tells it, I mean, it's scary because it plays out almost like in a horror movie where she says, well, if I say something to him, he'll insist that no, he has to be correct, and all these people are essentially going to be poisoned. So she finally, she figures out that she's going to drop it, and then she even steps on it after she drops it, and she's like, oh, I've ruined all of these, and he picks up the one piece of it she hadn't stepped on and says, oh, well, this one looks okay, and she grabs it from him and throws it in the trash and says, no, they're dirty. And this is the same man who also later on tells her about how he keeps a lump of curare in his pocket because it's so deadly and it just makes him feel powerful. And she actually used him as a direct inspiration for the murderer in The Pale Horse. I won't get more specific than that. Don't want to spoil The Pale Horse, but she brings that up even in the autobiography that Mr. P is exactly who she was thinking of when she crafted that murder. And he's one of the most upsetting murderers within the canon, which is saying something. So yeah, it's a striking story for sure.
Yes, absolutely. And you can see how her world was very much opened up in these awful circumstances. The poisons is so interesting. It's so many of the novels do revolve around poison. And this is on a more jokey register, but one of the items in what we did in the Great War it's a report on a coroner's inquest at Torquay. And it informs its readers that the deceased was supposed to be progressing favorably when he died suddenly, immediately after swallowing a dose of medicine. Now, none of the album's contributors actually puts her initials to this particular item, but I think the resonance with a certain literary output is kind of unmissable, really, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And I actually wanted to ask you a question because it seems as though I know toward the end of this document as well in this magazine, there's reference made to, the war is ending and this club has to end. So it seems as if this document was made when Christie was in the dispensary, since she spent approximately the first, let's say, 2 years from 1914 to 1916 as a nurse on the ward, and then the second 2 years from 1916 to 1918 as a dispenser. So was this, I know this is a little speculative, it's hard to, and I want to be clear about that, but it seems as though this must have been put together while she was a dispenser. Is that safe to say?
I think so, yes. There are nurses and matrons, and obviously some of the other authors were probably not dispensers.
Right.
They put it together, at the end it says the war is over. But I think the pieces probably date from, they didn't write it all in a rush at the end of the war. I think it had been something that Agatha and her pals had been doing for quite some time and all contributing to. And yes, so you're right. She would have been a dispenser for most of it, but remembering as well her nursing. But it was the poisons and the dispensary, medicines, one should call them, I suppose, that are the main contributor to her work. Just the general wartime atmosphere, but anyway, so what I'd just like to read out is one of the spoof job ads for her in the magazine. It's one of the spoof job ads, job wanted ads in the magazine. And it says this: literary lady seeks situation, dispenser, musical, thoroughly domesticated, good cook, toilet specialist. Now, these gently raised young women have come a long way from their sheltered pre-war lives. And it's just, is that her? Is that who they're talking about? We don't know. But literary lady, dispenser, I think that was a joke at her expense, wasn't it? But the tone here is educated and witty. And one of the spoof legal queries are answered by Pericles. And Aunt Agatha's puzzle page, another Aunt Agatha, extending her range from problem page to puzzle page, includes a dig at Cubist art, which, back then is was quite something, I think. And the writers also, what's really lovely is they demonstrate a deep warmth and affection for each other's foibles. There's a running joke about trying to keep chickens. And I think this, these jokes, and there's another running joke about Pearly Tusco toothpaste, some made up, silly toothpaste brand. And that shows a keen sense of the ridiculous. And I think this was all an essential counterbalance to the appalling injuries and the shattered lives that they cared for every day on the wards. There was that awful darkness, but that's how they kept themselves going. And at the end, it says, the war is over, the club must close. They obviously felt themselves very much to be, a band of sisters.
Yeah, it's a fascinating document. It sounds like a fascinating document. I'm going to include a link to this for anyone who's interested, but we should mention that this handmade magazine is actually on exhibition currently at the Royal College of Nursing in Cavendish Square in London. I believe it's called Shining a Light, A History of Nursing Support Work. And that's going to be available to view from May through October of this year. Obviously, the focus of the exhibition is not Agatha Christie. It's not for mystery fans per se, but I would 100%, be making a pilgrimage there and taking a look at everything once I'm there, but also go and taking maybe an extra close look at this document at that point. And then it sounds like there may be something in the works for next year's Agatha Christie Festival as well.
Well, what we're hoping is, nothing's confirmed yet, is to have an event and an exhibition where we'll have the document, but of course you can only ever really look at one page at once, but to have some proper photographs taken of the other pages so people can read, have the time to read all these funny little jokes and extraordinary skits and parodies.
Yeah, to pour over them. Yes, not with our fingers paging through, obviously. Can't do that, unfortunately. But
even with white gloves, that would not be.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a couple of things also just come to mind from what you were saying, Karen, which I'd love to talk about a little bit more, which is I've never even really thought about the sort of the bifurcation of experience that she had in the VAD, being a nurse and then being a dispenser in that way, which is why I did kind of want to pinpoint when this was probably happening. And you can see that bifurcation in what she says in her autobiography. I mean, I went back to her autobiography in preparation for this conversation because as I mentioned up top, she really does talk about this period at some length in her autobiography. And I think it's really interesting just to note how differently she thought about nursing versus dispensing. She writes, "From the beginning, I enjoyed nursing. I took to it easily and found it, and have always found it, one of the most rewarding professions that anyone can follow. I think if I had not married, that after the war, I should have trained as a real hospital nurse. Maybe there is something in heredity. My grandfather's first wife, my American grandmother, was a hospital nurse," which is really interesting. So she seems to have taken to nursing. And then this is what she said about dispensing. "I can't say I enjoyed dispensing as much as nursing. I think I had a real vocation for nursing and would have been happy as a hospital nurse. Dispensing was interesting for a time, but became monotonous. I should never have cared to do it as a permanent job. On the other hand, It was fun being with my friends. And I think that's a little bit of an oblique reference probably to what she was doing when they were putting together this document. It seems to me that she had more quote unquote downtime as a dispenser than she did as a nurse, which is interesting because she credits that downtime or that free time with why she was able to start writing a detective story, why she was able to start writing The Mysterious Affair at Styles. And I think that if she had stayed on as a nurse for that entire time, she probably wouldn't have had, quite frankly, the leisure. I don't want to say leisure. She's still working and she's doing very, very hard work, but just the room to be able to think about and even work on what would become The Mysterious Affair at Styles. And I think we can see that she was sort of airing those creative pursuits, perhaps in a little bit more of a fun and frivolous and collective way in this document. But it seems like she was exercising the same muscle there, and that it's something that she was able to do once she had transitioned to her dispensing work. And I just want to quote from her one more time in the autobiography. It was while I was working in the dispensary that I first conceived the idea of writing a detective story. Unlike nursing, where there always was something to do, dispensing consisted of slack or busy periods. Sometimes I would be on duty alone in the afternoon with hardly anything to do but sit about. Having seen that the stock bottles were full and attended to, one was at liberty to do anything one pleased except leave the dispensary. And I just love the idea that we can imagine her, yes, sitting there and thinking about what would become The Mysterious Affair at Styles, but also turning to this project that she was doing in a similarly creative spirit with her friends. And it just makes looking at that document, I think reading through it, that much more fascinating because it places you within that creatively fertile period in her young life.
Oh, yes, it was the start of everything, really, wasn't it? And of course, Captain Hastings, because Poirot and Hastings appear for the first time in The Mysterious Styles, her first novel. And Hastings was a wounded soldier. He'd been sent back, invalided back to Britain from the war. She saw so many of them, in her daily life in the hospital. Yeah. And of course, Poirot was a war refugee from Belgium. So it seeped into everything. I think it's interesting that maybe she did have more time to write it, but the poison plot, I think, and the subsequent poison plots in so many, a good handful of the other novels, definitely had their birth there. And I do wonder what Agatha Christie's books would have been like if she'd never had the chance to work in a dispensary.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that it's not even just the exposure to these poisons / medicines that she was working with. It was just, I think, opening up of her life, like you said, seemingly not wearing a corset, mixing with lots of different people.
We will get to the bottom of that. The corset.
Yeah. It would absolutely. I want to know for myself as well. But just all of the different people she was meeting, both in terms of the nurses, the doctors, the chemists, and of course the soldiers, the people who were coming in. And she talks in her autobiography about speaking with all of them. It was opening, I think, her experience up in a way that very much affected her writing and probably spurred her on to write. And then once she moved on to the dispensary, giving her a little bit of the leisure time that she always had before the war, right? I mean, it's not like she didn't have that before, but that experience combined with some of the free time is what allowed her to do it.
And of course, young Agatha Miller had always written poems and creative soul. She was always doing something. But yeah, this certainly focused her in a very particular way.
Yeah, well, and I also just wanted to highlight what I believe is the final item in this magazine, at least from the article in the Sunday Times that I read, which was this spoofy pharmaceutical style harlequinade.
Oh, yes.
Okay, let's talk about that for a second, because we know I've talked a lot about it on the podcast about how Christie was fascinated by the harlequinade from a young age. She actually wrote a long poem about the characters within the harlequinade. It's one of the first things she wrote. It's featured in her first Poirot short story, The Affair at the Victory Ball, which you can tell from the title is placed just at the end of the First World War. And she would, of course, go on to write a series of short stories that would be collected as The Mysterious Mr. Quin, which plays with various aspects of the harlequinade. So this one features the characters Farmacello, Chemistine, and Dispensella. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, yes. Well, I think you more or less said it all. Really, it's the traditional story of Harlequin and the traditional
Columbine. Yeah.
Columbine. Harlequin. I think the most moving thing though is that last line: "The war is o'er, the club must close." And that's the end. And they recognize that they've had this very intense experience and now on to whatever the piece is going to bring.
Yeah, well, and that's actually a perfect segue because the other thing I wanted to talk about is this tone, this sort of witty, airy tone that the pieces seem to have. I would love to compare that a little bit or contrast it really with what her, real experience was in the VAD to the extent that we can even access it, right? And again, I'll just go direct to the source, which is her autobiography. She's mainly sunny, I think, in the same way about her wartime experience when she writes about it from a great distance. She tells this really amusing story about having to transcribe a love letter for a soldier who could neither read nor write. And then after she did, he said, okay, now I want you to write that in triplicate for the 3 different women who he was wooing at the same time. And she was even like, don't you want me to make it a little different? And he was like, no, you don't have to. And she has a bunch of amusing stories like that. But she does also recount fainting during her first surgery, which was an abdominal surgery and quite bloody, and how she always had to turn her head away when the first incision would be made with the surgeon's scalpel.
And at that point as well, the fainting, there was the reaction in the operating theatre, not surprisingly, really, but we were talking about the slight edge between the professional nurses and the volunteers. And she described in an interview how she was attended her first operation and she was shaking all over. And Sister Anderson didn't say, "Oh, come along, dear, come and sit down." She just told her off, really, and told her to put herself together. There was no quarter given for this sheltered young woman suddenly seeing surgery on a very wounded person.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, she also references, and this is, somewhat of a notorious reference, or I think one that gets a lot of play among Christie enthusiasts or Christie scholars, having to do with the disposal of an amputated limb. This is what she writes in the autobiography. It is all somewhat of a haze now, yet one recalls odd instances standing out in one's memory. I remember a young probationer who had been assisting in the theater and had been left behind to clean up, and I had helped her take an amputated leg down to throw into the furnace. It was almost too much for the child. Then we cleared up all the mess and blood together. She was, I think, too young and too new to it to have been given that task to do alone so soon. And I think how like Christie to put this memory in the context of someone else not being able to handle this grim task. Obviously, it's something that stuck with her all this time for a reason. And understandably, she was putting a limb into a furnace. But I think you can get a sense of that sort of it's the stiff upper lip, to be cliched about it, which sort of resonates throughout her accounts in the autobiography and seems to resonate in What We Did in the Great War in this collection. It was a hard time, but they had a lot of good laughs, and they're going to choose to focus on the laughs. And that's the exact attitude that ushers us into the good times of the 1920s, right? Which could sometimes be a brittle sort of a good humor. There's a lot of lightness and laughter on the surface, but perhaps a lot of trauma directly behind it. I don't know. Do you think that's fair?
I think that's entirely right. So yeah, the tone of this wonderful magazine it just shows you the resilience, good humor, common sense, camaraderie. That's what those women had with and for each other. Very much the stiff upper lip. The incident with the amputated limb, I think that young person there was about 11. Really young, a child, really. And that gives you suddenly a little insight into what was going on during the First World War. It was literally all hands to the pump. Everybody do what they could. And if they had to have children helping out in the hospital, so be it. And that's almost an incidental fact that you get there and think, my God, imagine 11-year-olds now suddenly having to do that.
I didn't realize that, but I think there was a lot of that sort of a thing. And the one other reference I just want to make here, I think it's a really interesting one and one that we should never forget with Christie. It has to do with her Mary Westmacott books, because we always get a lot of autobiographical detail in the Mary Westmacott books. And because I think she was a somewhat reticent person, we sometimes get more of the emotional truth. I think this is, of course, my theorizing here as a reader, but I think sometimes we get more emotional truth as to her personal experiences in the Mary Westmacott novels. It's something I've only gotten to talk about on the podcast's Patreon account, where we cover Mary Westmacott novels, but the Mary Westmacott novel, Unfinished Portrait, for example, practically has line-for-line recreations of her stories in her autobiography, but often with a lot of emotional context added. And I think we get something similar in Christie's first Mary Westmacott novel, which is Giant's Bread. And there's a young woman in that novel named Nell, who becomes a nurse during the Great War. And it's not a long quote, but I just want to read out this little description of her experience as a nurse in what feels very, very similar to what Christie did during the war. And here is how she puts it. Little by little, she sank into the hospital rut. At first, she had suffered a heartrending pang at the sight of the wounded. The first dressing of wounds at which she assisted was almost more than she could bear. Those who longed to nurse, that's put in quotation marks, usually brought a certain amount of emotionalism to the task, but they were soon purged of it. Blood, wounds, suffering were everyday matters. And we even get a recreation of the amputated leg with that young nurse who, was forced to do it in Giant's Bread. My thought on it is that Christie felt like she could air those sorts of grievances and the grim side of things in a fictional account like that. But when it came to the way that one conducted oneself in one's own life, you put a good face on things and you focused on the camaraderie and the way that we were going to get through this together. And I just think it's a really interesting contrast and shows Christie, the person, versus Christie, the writer, and how she used her writing sometimes, I think, to be able to express herself differently. And I just love the idea that this too is a creative document, but it's being used in a very different way. And part of that obviously is the fact that it is collaborative, but it's just fascinating to me to contrast the two.
Yes, absolutely. I think what you said about, the atmosphere of the 1920s being somewhat febrile in its joy brings us back to Sylvia Payne, because Sylvia Payne was a qualified doctor when at the start of the war, and when she ran the VAD hospital in Torquay Town Hall. And after the war, she went to work in something called the Medico-Psychological Clinic in Brunswick Square in London, which had been founded in 1913. It was mainly for psychological help. And as the war went on, increasingly, they treated men with, well, they didn't call it PTSD then, did they? But what they called war shock.
Right.
And psychoanalyst Ken Robinson, who was formerly the honorary archivist of the Institute of Psychoanalysis and has been very helpful explaining about Sylvia Payne to me, said that her decision to seek psychoanalytic training and then become a preeminent and pioneering psychoanalyst grew out of her experience of war shock. And she wasn't alone in that. So, that was all part of the tenor of the times.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. And I think that's an important point just to emphasize. She was a medical doctor when she was working at the hospital in Torquay during the war. Yes, she had her medical degree.
Oh, yes. Yeah. It was one of, I think, something like 3% of the qualified doctors in the UK at that time were women.
Mm. Wow.
Really, it wasn't a thing that women did. So she was pioneering on many fronts. But yes, we don't really know what Agatha and Sylvia, how, what their life, if they had any contact after the war. At some point, they had some contact, and Sylvia was sent this second copy, which we think that Agatha had 2 copies and then sent her one. Don't know if there are any other copies around in other people's archives or family papers, but we really did. Agatha Christie had not surprisingly, as a very accomplished, distinguished woman herself, a lot of equally distinguished women friends in different fields of endeavor. But there's nothing so far come up to show the two of them together after the war.
That they had any significant interaction. Yeah, you never know. Well, it seems that she did send it, that even the address, right, that is on the envelope that this came in, that Christie herself perhaps sent it to her, that the address is written out in her hand.
Yes, the Christie handwriting experts have had a look, and it's very possible. But we can speculate, but we really don't know. Although, of course, there are other writers and contributors to this document. We know there are two of them, so it's not unique. Although each of the two, the one the Christie Archive has and the psychoanalyst one, they are unique because the hand watercolored portraits of dispensers and matrons and nurses and that are part of this project are all hand done, and so each one is different. But and there are slight differences between the two because they're not carbon copies. They were typed and then typed again.
How long is it, by the way?
It's about 50 pages long with the text and the illustrations.
Oh, wow. That's great. That's a nice substantial magazine there.
Oh, yes. And it contains, there's musical notation. They were very cultured and educated, the women who wrote this. There is musical notation to songs they've made up themselves. And Dr. Michael Parsons, who brought the document in with Sylvia Payne's analysis, he looked at the musical notation and started to hum it. And he knew he could, very educated man, he could read music as well as being a psychoanalyst. And he recognized First World War popular tunes that his own father used to hum when he was a little boy. So, it's terribly resonant of that time. And and also the other interesting thing we were talking about, there are two copies now, we know, not exactly copies, but not exactly identical. But there were, of course, other writers. And one who features a lot is called E.M. Well, that's her initials. And I'm just wondering, did E.M.'s family have her copy? Did she keep a copy? Are there others?
Yeah, well, I mean, isn't she identified as the third dispenser? I mean, I would think there has to be the first and second dispenser copies too.
Well, yes, very possibly. Maybe that will start flooding in now. But
right. Well, then even the musical notation and the musicality of it, that's so Christie as well. She composed her own waltz when she was younger, and she studied in Paris. She wanted to be a singer or a concert pianist. She ultimately decided she did not have the constitution for performing because her nerves would get the better of her. She talks about that in her autobiography as well. She says it was as though her body would rebel against her and she wouldn't be able to do what she wanted it to do, which is why writing suits her so much more, since there's nothing performative about that. But not that I'm saying she did all of the musical notation in there, but I'm sure she would have very much appreciated it and taken part in it and just sort of taken joy in that aspect of the creative process as well.
Well, exactly. As you say, we don't know if she did, but she certainly could have. So
yeah. I cannot wait at some point, however it happens, either by visiting the Royal College of Nursing in Cavendish Square, where this is currently on exhibition, or perhaps, if it works out, potentially this will be something that we can all see at the Agatha Christie Festival next year, maybe even with a panel about it. But I think this is just a fascinating document that I had never heard of before, even though another version of it existed in the archive. There's so much. There's always something new to discover, I think, when it comes to to Agatha Christie. And this is just a really, really, I think, fascinating entry into a part of her life that we don't necessarily talk about all that much because we don't often have a way of accessing it, but we really do with this document. So I really appreciate being able to talk about it at some length with you, Karen. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Well, thank you, Kemper. It's been fascinating, and I've learned a lot from your expertise.
Hopefully I will see you at the Agatha Christie Festival, if not this year, then next year.
Hope so, yeah.
Thank you so much to Karen Robinson. What a great conversation we had. And I am definitely going to try to look up that exhibition when I am in England in September. As I said I would, I am providing a link in the show notes to that exhibition for anyone who would like to attend. For next week's episode, I'm doing a little bit of a different theme. It is Pride Month in June here in the United States. Every June is Pride Month. And I thought that was a great opportunity to do an episode focusing on the quote-unquote gay characters of Agatha Christie. Are they gay? Are they queer? What do we even mean by those words? I will get into it on the episode, and I will also be rerunning one of my very favorite interview episodes that Catherine and I did with longtime friend of the podcast, Jamie Berntal, whose book, Queering Agatha Christie, has been essential reading for this podcast. We did that interview some time ago, so I'm sure the audio quality is really bad, but I think it's worth revisiting. And I always love being able to showcase Catherine here on this podcast whenever I can. So that is what I'll be doing for my next episode, a pride-filled episode. You, of course, can always check out the podcast's bonus content over on Patreon. I have put a link in the show notes. For June, I will be comparing Agatha Christie's theatrical play, The Stranger, and Frank Vosper / Agatha Christie's play, Love from a Stranger. It's going to be one of my All About Agatha in the Theater episodes. So go on over to Patreon if that whets your appetite. You can always email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. You can find the podcast on Twitter at allaboutthedame and on Instagram at allaboutagatha. You can find me on Facebook at Kemper Donovan Books, and you can buy my debut mystery novel, The Busybody, in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia and New Zealand. I have provided links for all of those territories. Check it out in the show notes. I believe that we are up to 999 ratings in Apple Podcasts, listeners. Please be the one to put us over the edge into 1,000 reviews. It will make me so very happy. Thank you to everyone who has already provided a rating and or review. Very, very appreciated. And I'll see you next time. Bye.
Ever tried reading while jogging, cooking, or even juggling flaming torches? Yeah, it doesn't end well. But with audiobooks.com, you can conquer books without the circus act. Dive into over 450,000 titles, including more than 10,000 free ones. Get hooked on a bestseller, find your next obsession, or finally read that classic you've been avoiding since high school. And here's the inside scoop. Sign up today for a free 30-day trial and snag your first 3 audiobooks on the house. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.